namely history. Right-wing culture warriors often argue that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and their left-wing opponents often respond that it was founded as a secular democracy. My thesis today is that both of these stories are wrong, or rather that they're too one-sided, because our civic tradition has sacred as well as secular sources. It is both civil and religious in origin, which is why I refer to it as our civil religion. And while some religion can divide us, this one has more often united us. And I think that it could help unite us again. Probably not all of us, but maybe enough of us to restart our civic conversation and begin moving the country forward again. So let's take a closer look at that history. Let's start with the Puritans, with John Winthrop, the longtime governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Shortly before he set sail for the New World in 1630, he gave a speech. "We have entered into a covenant," he said, "and if we live up to its terms, we shall be as a city on a hill. If we don't," he warned, "we will soon be brought low." So Winthrop did not mean that America would be singled out for special blessings. On the contrary, he meant that we would be placed under special judgment. What did he think we would be judged for? Our economic prosperity, our military might, our winning? No, for our charity and self-abridgment, for our meekness and unity. So that's the religious strand in Winthrop's thought, but here's the secular one. Quote, "No commonweal can be founded but by free consent." Commonweal simply being an old-fashioned word for republic. Now, the original charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony envisioned a for-profit commercial venture, not a Puritan experiment in self-government. By the terms of the original charter, only stockholders were to have political rights. Winthrop helped draw up a new constitution that extended political rights, not to all members of the community, to be sure, but to all white male church members, which, as conservative as it may sound today, was a pretty radical thing to do in an aristocratic age of monarchical self-government. So from the very beginning, our civil religion had a sacred strand drawn from biblical religion, as well as a secular one taken from political philosophy. Of course, the Puritans themselves fell well short of these ideals, not least in their dealings with the Native Americans. But the ideals themselves, justice and liberty, are noble ones nonetheless. Now let's turn to what we might see as the second founding of the United States, the American Revolution. Here again we find a complex mixture of sacred and secular sources blended together. Take the Declaration and the Constitution. The Declaration, of course, famously says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The Constitution continues, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." These are familiar words to many of us, of course. Now, some interpreters have argued that the American Constitution is godless. And they're right, insofar as the Constitution itself contains no mention of God. But the same, of course, cannot be said of the Declaration, which speaks explicitly of a Creator, a God who made us all equal and who endowed us with certain unalienable rights. So again, the familiar mixture of sacred and secular. Now, some might say that this is a mixture of oil and water, and so it may seem to many today. Not so to the founding generation, though. For them, biblical religion and democratic self-government fit together hand in glove. The touchstone text for many of them was 1 Samuel 8. Here's how they read it. When the Israelites requested a king, God gave them one, but only as a form of punishment. For what is a king but a false god, an idol? Self-governing republics are the form of government appropriate to a righteous people. I should note that they did not come up with this reading themselves. In fact, they borrowed it from medieval rabbis. Now, how widespread was this view, you might ask? Well, it certainly extended well beyond the ranks of Orthodox Christians. That much is for certain. Consider Benjamin Franklin. Not exactly a Puritan, right? His proposal for the national seal of the United States showed the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. Or consider that runaway bestseller of the Revolutionary era, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Now, Paine was certainly no Christian, but here's how he argued for a republic. Quote, "The prophet Samuel expressly disapproves of government by kings. For near 3,000 years," he continued, "Israel was a kind of republic administered by a judge and the elders of the tribe. That is, until the Jews, under a national delusion, requested a king." So even the most skeptical of the founders regarded biblical religion and republican self-government as potentially complementary. Now, like the Puritans, the founders fell short of their own ideals as well. While the Declaration loudly declared that all men are created equal, the Constitution tacitly downgraded African slaves to 3/5 of a person. So long as men was taken to mean free white men, there was no contradiction. But as the abolitionist movement took hold, more and more Americans began to challenge this assumption. Now, some defenders of Southern slavery sought to do away with the contradiction by doing away with the Declaration itself. John C. Calhoun, the chief ideologue of Southern slavery, dismissed the claim that all men are created equal as a blatant falsehood. He also wanted to strike a couple of phrases from the Constitution while he was at it. What troubled Calhoun most was the phrase, "We the people of the United States." He thought it should read, "We the peoples of these United States." For it was the people of each separate state, in his view, that were sovereign. He didn't believe in the United States as a sovereign nation at all. Now, many white Northerners agreed with Calhoun, including at first the young Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln didn't like slavery, but he didn't believe in full racial equality either, certainly not as a young man. Nor was he of the opinion that the federal government possessed the power to abolish slavery. What changed his mind? In part, it was his own rereading of the founders' writings and the founding documents. After months of study in the library in Springfield, Lincoln concluded that the spirit of these documents was concluded in their preambles, and that the spirit sometimes overrode the letters contained in their articles. This meant that the Declaration's claim that all men are created equal overrode the 3/5 clause of the Constitution. It also meant that the constitutional quest for a more perfect union ultimately trumped the sovereignty of the individual states, even on the question of slavery. Lincoln was not the only one to reach this conclusion, and was probably also not the first. The abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass was of the same mind, and it seems very likely that Douglass was the one who changed Lincoln's mind on this point as well. For Calhoun, then, the American covenant had one value, and one value only: freedom. For Lincoln, as for Douglass, it had at least two. Free government, yes, but also social equality. The United States had failed to live up to this creed, and the Civil War was its punishment for its broken covenant. Or so Lincoln argued in his famous words from his second inaugural address. "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid with another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must still be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." The Americans had broken their covenant, he argued, and the war was their punishment. What, I sometimes wonder, will ours be? Now, for a brief time after Reconstruction, the United States pursued racial equality in a serious way. But with the election of Andrew Johnson, they quickly reverted to their old backsliding ways, as have we. Let's turn from Reconstruction to the Progressive era. A lot has changed. Industrialization has made the United States more powerful. Immigration has made it more diverse. World War I has turned it into a global power. It had also resulted in massive social inequality, in a nativist backlash against Asian Americans, in an epidemic of lynchings, in imperialist misadventures overseas. In other words, the progressive era was an awful lot like our own. And therein lies cause for hope as well as despair, because the progressive era was also a period of civic renewal, a period when some thinkers revitalized their civil religious tradition by returning to some of its deepest sources, philosophy and theology. Let's start with the man who came to be known as America's philosopher, John Dewey. Born in Vermont, raised a Protestant, Dewey became a professor of philosophy here at Chicago and then at Columbia. In the process, he lost his religion, but not his faith, at least not his faith in democracy. Indeed, for Dewey, American democracy was a kind of spiritual project. In many ways, Dewey's views anticipated and shaped those of today's secular progressives. Like them, he believed that increased federal power was necessary to safeguard democratic freedom. In an earlier America, in an agricultural America, where property was more equally distributed, at least in the North, the power of the many had been sufficient to counterbalance the power of the few. But in the new America, industrial America, property was so concentrated in the hands of the few that they could ride roughshod over the interests of the many. The only way that a balance between the few and the many could be restored, Dewey argued, was if a democratic citizenry used the power of the federal state to counterbalance the power of the wealthy few. Democratizing freedom would involve tempering the capitalist economy with the powers of the national state. Dewey's version of secular progressivism drew heavily on ancient philosophy. Indeed, as you can see here, it drew on the theory of constitutional balance first set forth by Greek and Roman Republican thinkers. Like the ancients, Dewey believed the democratic constitution was a necessary condition for a successful republic, but not a sufficient one. For him, civic education was equally crucial. Indeed, for Dewey, one purpose of public education was to form democratic citizens, not by indoctrinating them with some whitewashed version of American history, but rather by instilling habits of democratic association, habits of experimentation, of cooperation, and of reflection. Still, civic education alone was not enough either. It had to be combined with what Dewey called a common faith. Now, for the ancients, that had meant a faith in the gods of the city. For most Americans, that had meant a faith in the God of the Bible. And for many, it still does. But Dewey's was a secular faith, a faith in democracy, not just as a form of government, but as a proposition about the cosmos. For him, the democratic project was a spiritual project and not just a political one. Let's now turn from America's philosopher to American theologian. That would be Reinhold Niebuhr. Born and raised in a small town in southern Illinois, Niebuhr was the son of a German pastor. Following his graduation from Yale Divinity School, Niebuhr spent most of his career at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Now, what made Niebuhr so influential? Not what most people think. As you probably know, the idea that Niebuhr became best known for was original sin, or rather, a particular understanding of original sin. In Niebuhr's view, the original sin was pride. Not just the sort of loud and boastful pride that is fed by a love of recognition and power, but also the quieter and subtler forms of pride that often hide behind a veil of feigned humility or public charity. Niebuhr worried a lot about the effects of individual pride in our own personal spiritual lives, but he worried even more about the effects of collective pride in our national political life. Indeed, the most dangerous forms of political pride, the ones that Niebuhr warned most strenuously against, are modern religious nationalisms. What makes religious nationalism so dangerous is that it conjoins spiritual and national pride, and often race and class pride as well. Religious nationalisms, Niebuhr warned, are not merely idolatrous, they are positively demonic. Demonic in the sense that they involve the invasion and possession of the self by a racial and national spirit that makes pretensions of divinity. Alas, America has still not exorcised this particular demon. If anything, we are more powerfully possessed by it now than ever before. In part because we now tend to regard pride and self-love as sources of empowerment or self-esteem, rather than as sources of danger and corruption. Niebuhr's views about human nature made him rather skeptical about some versions of secular progressivism, including, to a certain extent, Dewey's. Consider Dewey's view that education is the cure for all ills. But education is only a panacea if ignorance is the root of all evil. What if the root of all evil is pride? Then humility and contrition will be more important than knowledge and education. Niebuhr was also skeptical about the progressive vision of progress itself, not because he denied the possibility of progress, but because history for him does not move in straight lines. Rather, in his vision, it forms a widening spiral. A spiral because progress is inevitably followed by regress. A widening spiral because the possibilities of human cooperation, as the possibilities of human cooperation expand, so too do the possibilities of human oppression. Globalization can lead to new forms of cosmopolitan solidarity, but also new forms of economic exploitation. Lastly, an upward spiral because history ascends towards justice, however haltingly. Of course, no account of our civic tradition would be complete without a discussion of Martin Luther King. What Lincoln had been to generations past, King is to ours, our greatest civic saint, a man whose words are known to every American schoolchild, whose speeches form a veritable civic catechism. King's stance was actually a lot like Lincoln's and Niebuhr's, highly critical of the American project, but ultimately affirming. King was fully aware of the moral rot that had spread through American society as a result of racial prejudice. He entertained no illusions about this. But he never gave up his hope for political redemption. In his various dream speeches, he urged his followers to recover an older dream, the American dream that used to be, not a shallow dream of material ease, but rather the nobler dream of human equality and national unity that had animated earlier generations of Americans. The substance of the dream is expressed in these sublime words, said King: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." King did not regard this dream as his alone. Echoing the Puritans, he argued that God somehow called America to do a special job for mankind in the world. Never before in the history of the world have so many racial groups and so many national backgrounds been assembled together in one nation, he declared. A statement even truer today than it was and is. And somehow, if we can't solve the problem in America, then the world can't solve the problem, because America is the world in miniature, and the world is America writ large. In this sense, King was an American exceptionalist of sorts. But his exceptionalism was not the Christianist and militarist exceptionalism of today. An American exceptionalism that sees the United States as an already chosen nation, the long arm of divine justice in a godless world. Rather, it was the original exceptionalism of the Puritan era, which saw America as an almost chosen nation, a people who had chosen to set themselves apart and place themselves under a higher law. Like Winthrop, King hoped that America could serve as an example to the world, and he warned of God's wrath should it fail. The judgment of God is upon us, he said, and we must either learn to live together as brothers, or we are all going to perish together as fools. These words, of course, are also truer than ever. Then came the culture wars of the 1980s and the 1990s. The civil religion started to unravel. There were still some veterans of the civil rights movements who kept it alive, but many on the left walked away from it. Some became technocrats, cheerleaders for globalization, preaching a gospel of growth. Others embraced a radical identity politics that highlighted our differences to the point of effacing our commonalities. Only a few held fast. And when the secular left let the civil religion go, the religious right quickly seized hold of it and thoroughly corrupted it. Jerry Falwell led the way. For those too young to remember, he was the founder of the Moral Majority. Now, like Niebuhr, Falwell had lots to say about sin, but for him, sin was always individual. It was never collective. And it was mostly sexual, never social. And when Falwell denounced the sins of the people, it was usually other people's sins he had in mind. The fornicators and the abortionists, the hedonists and the secularists, never the fallen members of his own flock. Of him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbor serve him for nothing and does not give him his wages, who says, I will build myself a great house with spacious upper rooms. Of this sinner, Falwell said nothing. And for the least of these, one often suspects he cared nothing. In Falwell's hands, the American civil religion devolved into a reactionary religious nationalism. And so it remains in the hand of his son and successor, Jerry Falwell Jr., one of Donald Trump's court evangelicals. Now, I'm afraid that Ronald Reagan also played some role in this process of corruption, though a much lesser and subtler one. Reagan liked to quote Winthrop too, or rather misquote him. For Reagan spoke of America not as a city on a hill, but as a shining city on a hill, a glittering object admired by all the world for its wealth, piety, and power. Reagan also spoke of evil, but only with reference to Soviet communism. The American people, by implication, were good, inherently good, and the United States were great, exceptionally great. So far from warning about the dangers of excessive national pride, Reagan subtly encouraged them. Gone too was the traditional worry about the corrupting potential of excessive luxury and wealth. For Reagan, wealth was good, and unambiguously so. The only real source of corruption in American life, he thought, was the state, especially the welfare state. And yet, at the close of his presidency, it's important to remember that Reagan did have this to say of his shining city. If there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get there. Reagan's civil religion was still racially inclusive, unlike the ethno-nationalism of today's GOP. Now, eventually the left did get its civil religion back. The turning point came in July of 2004 when that skinny guy with the funny name walked onto that stage in Boston. I stand here knowing that my story is part of the larger American story, he said, that I owe a debt to all those who came before me, and that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. The greatness of our nation, he insisted, is based on a very simple premise summed up in a declaration made over 200 years ago. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He called on the audience to hold up these shared ideals against the hard reality of present-day America and asked himself seriously how we're measuring up. And he did not hesitate to give concrete examples when we were falling short. Standing together, he said, is what allows us to pursue our individual dreams, yet still come together as a single American family. E pluribus unum, out of many one. 3.5 years later, in March of 2008, Barack Obama walked onto another stage. This one was in Philadelphia. The infamous Jeremiah Wright videos had surfaced just a few weeks before, and Obama had finally decided to face the issue head-on by giving a speech on race in America. There was much discussion of the speech's contents, and rightly so, but I want to emphasize the framing, which was a bit unusual. The speech was delivered at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, rather than, say, the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And the opening was taken not from one of King's speeches, say, but from the preamble to the Constitution. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Above all, I want to emphasize that the narrative was taken straight out of Exodus. There was talk of founding covenants, the Declaration and the Constitution, of original sins, African slavery, of a people's backsliding and marching, Jim Crow and civil rights, of a promised land that was always just over the horizon, the beloved community. The civil religion had been torn to shreds by 3 decades of culture war, but somehow Obama had managed to piece it together again. And tattered as it was, it had not lost its appeal. That much was clear from the rapturous crowds at Obama's rallies. Those campaign rallies often resembled religious revivals, civil religious revivals. Alas, the new version of the civil religion was not as sturdy as the old. It had originally been woven out of 2 threads, remember? One was the Exodus story, the story of the people who fled slavery for the promised land, who covenanted together around a common creed, who wandered in the desert and broke the covenant, who renewed the covenant and peered over the mountaintop. That was the thread that Obama was pulling on. But there was a second thread, too, almost as old as the first: civic republicanism. Republicanism, small r republicanism, is a political ideal that goes back to ancient Greece and Rome. In a word, it's the ideal of a free and self-governing people, a people that eschews the flattery of would-be tyrants. Now, Obama's version of the American story drew mainly on the biblical story of Exodus, and the Republican thread was mostly missing from his tapestry, and this weakened it considerably. So what can we still learn from this ancient tradition? A lot, I think. Firstly, that democratic institutions are very, very fragile, something that is becoming clearer and clearer to us with each passing day. Much more fragile than we Americans have tended to think. Asked what sort of constitution we have, Benjamin Franklin is supposed to have replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Whether we do and will remains an open question. The next 2 years will likely be decisive. The second lesson that we might take from civic republicanism is that progress is not irreversible. Contemporary progressives sometimes imagine that history is like an escalator. Step on, it moves up it moves in only one direction, up, and without much effort on our parts. For civic republicans, history is a bit more like a car jack. A small increment of progress requires an enormous amount of effort. And that upward progress can all come crashing down very quickly if someone hits the release lever. Third, civic republicans know that democratic institutions are very easily corrupted. And they had a very different notion of corruption than we do. Today, we think of corruption as quid pro quo or pay to play. We've got plenty of that, to be sure, but civic republicans understood corruption much more broadly, as simply putting private interest ahead of the public good, whether those interests happen to be personal, corporate, or partisan. This too is pervasive. Finally, civic republicans know that self-government requires civic virtue, not in the Victorian sense of prudery or politesse, but in the ancient sense of bravery and self-sacrifice for the common good. Laws and institutions are not enough to preserve a free government. People must be ready to defend free institutions. But too many of us have forgotten these ancient truths. And this is one reason, not the only one, that the American Republic is currently in such peril. Probably the greatest danger it's been in since World War II. A danger that is only magnified by our current political polarization. Overcoming that polarization is not going to be easy. Those of us who are secular progressives might begin by recognizing the role that biblical religion has played in American history, and indeed in the history of American progressivism itself. For secular progressivism is, in many ways, simply a secularized version of liberal Protestantism. Conversely, those of us who are religious conservatives need to acknowledge the influence of secular philosophy on America's founding creed, and indeed on American religion. The religious freedom that religious conservatives prize so dearly owes more than a little to Lockean liberalism, which made religious freedom the foundation of all individual rights. Having acknowledged that, we might shift our focus from the contentious issues about which we often disagree, the core values about which we mostly still agree. Equality and freedom, for example. Both are enshrined in our founding documents. To them, I would add solidarity and inclusion. Solidarity in the sense of the general welfare clause found in our Constitution, and inclusion in the sense of our national motto, E pluribus unum. Those to me are the four key points of our civic creed: freedom, equality, inclusion, and solidarity. Now I list them in what seems to me to be their order of priority: freedom, equality, inclusion, solidarity, but some would disagree. Some might put equality before freedom, for instance, or solidarity before inclusion. I would also argue that the founders understood freedom mainly in political terms as Republican freedom, but some might disagree. They might understand freedom mainly in economic terms, namely as market freedom or property rights. Or maybe you think that religious freedom is our first freedom. Now, all of these are arguments that are actually worth having. Some people think that the source of our problems today is that we argue too much. I actually think the reverse. I think is that we argue too little. Of course, sometimes we engage in ad hominem attacks. We trade insults then instead of arguments. At other times, we claim that one of our civic values trumps all of the others. Conservative libertarians insist that freedom of speech must have absolute priority over considerations of inclusion. Liberal multiculturalists contend the opposite. Neither side wants to talk about how to balance freedom and inclusion. And that's perhaps because it's very hard. Absolutism in values is much easier. Now, the civil religious tradition is not going to resolve these debates for us, but it does at least tell us what we should be arguing about, namely the meaning of freedom, equality, inclusion, and solidarity, and how to balance them. Those are the philosophical stakes of the American experiment, that these core values can be brought into some measure of harmony with each other. Now, I don't want to suggest that talk alone is enough. We also desperately need to rebuild our civic solidarity. But the present crisis is also a crisis of solidarity. A first step in that direction might be for all of us to redirect a little of our time, energy, and money away from national electoral politics. We might start by investing in a place, not a virtual web 2.0 place, but a sky and earth and meet and greet type of place. We might continue by joining an organization, not a point and click kind of an organization, but an demediated organization where people meet face to face, where people work together on common projects. And while it's important to work within our communities, we also need to work across them, because our communities are highly segregated, more segregated than ever, not only by race, of course, but now by religion, and party, class, and age. Sad truth is that we're all segregationists now, even the most cosmopolitan amongst us, who often have more friends and colleagues on the other side of the world than on the other side of the tracks. These are all things that we can do as individuals on our own personal initiative to rebuild civil society. But what can we do together as a nation? Here are a few ideas. First, a renewed program of civic education. The truth is, many Americans know very little about American institutions and even less about American history. Why not give every American student the same civics test that every applicant for American citizenship has to pass? And why not make passing that test a condition for graduation from high school? Second, make civic holidays into holidays again. Days when people do not work and cannot shop. Days when people might talk to their neighbors or even watch a parade. Make election day such a day, as it is in many countries. Third, institute a system of national service. Require that all young people spend a year or two doing something for their country. Could mean joining the military, but it might mean clearing a trail, or teaching a class, or helping out in an addiction program. Whatever. Only no waivers and no exceptions. I could be wrong, but my guess is actually that most Americans would support measures like these. But like a lot of things that most Americans support, it seems pretty hard to imagine them becoming law right now. Why? Well, of course, because our political system is so thoroughly corrupted and polarized that nothing meaningful gets done. The chief source of this corruption is obvious to anybody who has eyes. It's money. The endless flow of influence money. When 5 of the 10 richest counties in the United States are in the Washington, D.C. area, you know that something is seriously wrong. I know that we can't completely stop the flow of money into politics. Money is a bit like water after all, but that doesn't mean that we can't slow or stanch the flow. As for our polarization, the political parties are as much to blame as the culture warriors. Using big data and statistical analysis, the two parties have carved up the United States to their own advantage. As a result of this increasingly sophisticated gerrymandering, most congressional districts are now safe districts, which means that most incumbents are far more worried about primary challengers in the fringes of their own party than they are about electoral challengers in the other party. This would be easy to fix if we simply put redistricting into the hands of independent bipartisan commissions. Candidates would then be forced to run towards the center instead of towards the fringes. Of course, not everybody is going to be interested in fixing the republic. Some, a small handful, after all, are profiting handsomely from its demise and squirreling away the proceeds in faraway places. Others, a growing number, I fear, are determined to win the culture wars by any means necessary, democratic or not. Still others are so disgusted by the entire affair that they've turned away from politics altogether. So, who does that leave? I think a lot of us, actually, enough to turn things around if we were to pull together, as long as we're willing to listen to the better angels of our shared history. Those of us who are still committed to making ours a nation of nations and a people of peoples, a flourishing, multi-ethnic democracy. That is the American experiment, an intergenerational experiment whose outcome is still unknown and still important. For in a sense, the eyes of the world are still upon us, and more than a few would like to see us fail. Not just because they hate our freedoms, though I'm sure some really do, but also because they despise our diversity. They wager that it is not possible to make a democratic people out of many peoples, an inclusive nation out of many nations. I wager that they're wrong, and I hope you do too, so that America may be America again, a land that's never been, but a land that still must be. Thank you.